The Canadian is Canada's most famous train. For over half a century, this stainless steel beauty has carved its way across Canada, with each car racking up over 10 million miles. That's enough for 200 round trips around the Earth. Now this is episode 2 in a series where I'll take the train across Canada, from here in Vancouver into Montreal, with a return trip shortly thereafter, all while making as many stops at Canada's Grand Railway hotels as possible in my attempt to rewind the clock to the golden age of train travel, coupled with uncovering some of Canada's biggest hidden gems along the way. In the last episode, we boarded here in Vancouver, winding east into the northern Canadian Rockies as the train would hug the Thompson River into our first stop, Jasper National Park, and we would spend 2 nights at the Jasper Park Lodge, the first railway hotel stop on this trip. But this episode, we will reboard and push east, leaving the Rockies behind, rolling into Alberta's capital of Edmonton, and the start of the next day will see us in the prairies of Saskatchewan, and arriving at the midway point of the journey later that night into Winnipeg, for a stop across the street from Union Station at the Fort Garry Hotel. And from there, the train will continue east through northern Ontario before we arrive in downtown Toronto, transfer trains, and head to Montreal 2 nights later. But this entire itinerary comes with a massive asterisk beside it, because as you'll see in this episode, the train is rarely on time. But in the meantime, sit back, enjoy the ride for episode 2 in my series traveling across Canada by train. So today we pick things back up in Jasper, Alberta, the main stopover in the Rockies on the Canadian, where we had just spent 2 nights inside the Jasper Park Lodge. But back in town, the Jasper Heritage Station has actually served the Jasper Park Lodge since it was built in 1926 by the Canadian National Railway. And inside this station actually lies some really cool promotional posters from when Canadian National actually had passenger service as well as steamship service not too long ago. But beside it lies the iconic Canadian National 6015, a relic from an era when rail travel was king, weighing in at over 500,000 pounds. And this sleeping giant is actually one of the lucky 20 steam locomotives that dodged the scrapyard after the full switch from steam to diesel in the 1950s. And her sister locomotive 6043 actually rests at our final destination for this video in Winnipeg, where she has sat in Assiniboine Park since 1962. And although neither of them compare to the 4014 big boy steam locomotive operated by the Union Pacific down in the States, as you see here, which by the way is an absolute dream of mine to experience one day, I think it's pretty cool that we still have a couple of these sleeping giants laying around, paying homage to a time when passenger trains ruled the Rockies. And although 4.5 hours behind schedule, at 3:30 p.m. sharp, we would board the Canadian and begin to roll out of Jasper with only a few hours of light ahead of us left in the Rockies. The station would begin to shrink behind us, dwarfed by the towering Mount Edith Cavell in the background, and while a few local elk begin to gather alongside the tracks, soon we would begin to pass through a couple miles of charred forest remains from the devastating summer wildfires here in Jasper. And the next stretch of track east out of Jasper through Henry House really puts in perspective the extent of the damage that happened to Jasper this summer. And as the peaks begin to get smaller and the valley begins to widen out, we will take the final curve out of Jasper, Alberta, around Brule Lake, and disappear into the tunnel ahead, passing through the invisible, official end of the northern Canadian Rockies out of Jasper National Park. Now tonight, our final stop will be destined for the capital of Alberta, in Edmonton. And although we are still a few hours away, this is the best day on board the train for one reason, and one reason only. It's prime rib night. Now, if you saw last week's video going from Vancouver to Jasper, or really any video on the Canadian at all on YouTube, you know that the food on board is absolutely phenomenal and world class. From pan-roasted chicken supreme to rack of lamb, chef-featured omelets, and some seriously outstanding desserts on board here. Chef Stewart and Chef Allen in the back are true craftsmen in the kitchen, but the dining cars themselves actually have a really cool story. Every one of the dining cars on the Canadian consist are named after the Canadian Pacific Railway hotels, From the Palliser dining car named after the Palliser Hotel in Calgary to the York Diner named after the Royal York in Toronto. All of these hotels existed because of early rail travel not allowing for heavy dining cars. The reason being that the steep grades in the Rockies made them a major liability, but that all changed in the early 1900s when the spiral tunnels were complete, reducing the grade down the big hill outside of Field, BC from 4% back down to a reasonable 2%, making dining cars in the Rockies a reality. And today, the chefs produce everything in this tiny kitchen, and Chef was actually nice enough to allow me into his kitchen, which is, let's be honest, it's basically a closet with a stove, obviously no deep fryer or grills for safety reasons, so everything cooks on a burner or in the oven. And absolute respect to the chefs for being able to produce food at the level in which they do, despite how tiny and restricting this kitchen could be. After polishing off one last dessert and that one last cup of coffee, that would draw dinner to an end, where shortly after we would pull into Edmonton for a midnight arrival. Edmonton was actually the last major city in Canada to remove all trains from its downtown core in 1998. So only 27 years ago, the Canadian actually arrived into downtown Edmonton. And from 1928 until 1963, this was the station that housed passenger service until it was knocked down and replaced with today's CN Tower, which would house passenger service underneath it, as you see here, which probably would have made for a really grand arrival seeing the Edmonton skyline off in the distance, with the tallest building in the city being your passenger depot. And on the theme of the Grand Railway Hotels of Canada in this series, that station was only a 700-meter walk away from the Hotel Macdonald, which was Edmonton's Grand Railway Hotel, completed in 1915. And I did a full dedicated video on the Mac last summer if you want to learn more about that. But when passenger service was removed and relocated to today's station, this station was actually originally a Greyhound bus depot that they would then add a train track behind so they could service trains at the back. And yes, it is nice just to have passenger service at all in Edmonton, because back in 1981 until 1985, all long-distance trains were cancelled. I think it pretty much sums up the dire state of passenger service in Canada at the moment of recording this video. And shortly after, we'd reboard, and I'd head off to bed, because tomorrow morning we'll be awaking in the prairies of Saskatchewan. So this morning, we rolled into a beautiful sunrise breaking over the Saskatchewan prairies. At least, that's what I thought, because this actually isn't the prairies. We're still in the foothills of Alberta. Last night, leaving Edmonton, we hit quite a bit of heavy freight traffic, and if you didn't know, in Canada, freight traffic reigns supreme, and passengers, not so much. Now, my dad worked for the Canadian Pacific once upon a time, and he always used to say the only time the passenger train was on time was when it was 24 hours late. And considering that a couple of other recent eastbound departures of the Canadian would finish 12, 22, and 16 hours late before our trip, the fact that we're only 8 hours behind schedule, although not great news for our reservation at the Fort Garry Hotel in Winnipeg later tonight, well, I guess we'll cross that track when we get there. Or should I say, if we get there.
My mother once told me that bad news was just good news in disguise.
Was this before she abandoned you?
Yes, it was.
And listen, on the positive side, longer delays just mean more train time, which increases the value that we're getting for the ticket prices that I paid, while simultaneously lowering the cost per hour on board. Depends on how you look at it. Is it glass half full, or is it glass half empty? I'm curious what you think, so drop a comment down below. We would spend all morning racing past grain elevators, pushing past potash mines, which are actually Saskatoon's top export, for those wondering. And by late afternoon, we'd begin rolling past increasing freight traffic, which, although might scare you from what I just told you about our delays from last night, but this is good news, because that means that we are slowly approaching the Canadian National Freight Yard that is located just outside Saskatoon, which, interestingly enough, is where our station is located. There was a time where passenger trains pulled directly into downtown Saskatoon, but in 1966, the city of Saskatoon would follow the footsteps of the city of Ottawa and begin removing all trains from their downtown core. The new station was here, about 9 kilometers outside of downtown Saskatoon, and the Bessborough Hotel, which is actually Saskatoon's Grand Railway Hotel and the second last railway hotel constructed by Canadian National. And like the Hotel Macdonald earlier, I did a dedicated video to the Bessborough last summer, so you can check that out if you're interested. But inside the Saskatoon station, it does have a nice tribute to CN's first president, Henry Thorne, who was responsible for building the Bessborough here, as well as the Hotel Vancouver and the Jasper Park Lodge that you saw last episode. although the departures board is pretty empty with only 2 departures a week heading east and westbound directions. And back outside, you may notice that we are actually the only people on the platform, not even the staff wanting to be out here because it was a chilly minus 31 degrees today.
Oh my god, it's so cold outside.
So, with that being said, we reboarded, heading out of Saskatoon, away from the freight yards, crossing the South Saskatchewan River, and heading for the border of the province that I was born in, Manitoba. Now listen, I love being optimistic, but realistically speaking, we're 8 hours late, which means we're probably going to miss my favorite part. Well, not probably, we're going to miss my favorite portion of the trip, and that is the Qu'Appelle Valley, specifically crossing the Uno Trestle, which is the longest trestle on this trip. But when life gives you lemons, you make hollandaise sauce, because this just means that instead, we're going to get treated to a signature prairie sunset. The red sky lighting up, stretching across the horizon as we would come into our second last stop of the evening for a quick engineer change in Melville, Saskatchewan, a town with a population just shy of 5,000 people and named in honor of Charles Melville Hayes, who was the Grand Trunk Pacific president, would end up going down on the Titanic, but Jasper and pretty much everything up north would not exist today without this man's innovations. So to him, thank you so much, but I got even more stories penciled in for him in a few weeks from now at the episode I'll be doing at the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa. After that, we would head out, leaving Melville in the darkness of the night, heading towards Winnipeg. Now, at around 4 a.m., we would make our final push into Winnipeg. And to be honest, not a lot of sleep happened tonight because, well, let's be honest, it's hard to fall asleep when you have no clue if you're going to be arriving at midnight. It could be 10 a.m., I mean, who knows? Plus, trying to set an alarm so that you can wake up and then leave the train so they're not continuing in the Northern Ontario where you wake up and say, well, I missed my stop. But at around 4:10 a.m., we would glide into downtown Winnipeg, past Main Street and over the Assiniboine River, pulling into Winnipeg Union Station 8 hours late on this frigid minus 30 night. And whether you're taking the train across Canada or staying at any of the Grand Railway hotels across this country, you can do it a lot more efficiently with today's video sponsor, SAILY. SAILY is an eSIM company that makes it more accessible to get connected anytime you're traveling abroad. And whether you're coming from the US to stay in Jasper or you're coming across from Europe to stay in Ottawa, SAILY has plans that are super affordable and available in over 180 different countries. You go online, find the plan that works best for you and how much data you want, download the app, and then when you get to your location, you're connected, and it's as simple as that. And I know that when I went to Spain earlier this year, I did my transatlantic voyage. I had the app already downloaded by the time that I got to the Barcelona airport. I flicked it on, I had data, I got my rental car, I had a 5-hour drive ahead of me, and it literally could not have been any easier. And whether your next travel excursion is like what I'm doing in this Railway Hotel series, or just going abroad, SAILY and I are going to make it even easier and more affordable than ever before to get a plan with 15% off. When you go to the link in the video description, click that link, and use the promo code TRAVIS, it's my full legal name, TRAVIS, 15% off your SAILY eSIM plan. They also come from the creators of NordVPN, which I've been using for over 5 years now. I love Nord, I love SAILY, I can't recommend them enough, and thank you to SAILY for making this series possible and sponsoring this video. Now, Winnipeg Union Station was constructed in 1909, following the arrival of the Grand Trunk Pacific 3 years earlier in 1906. The station would be a union of the Grand Trunk Pacific and the Canadian Northern Railways, hence why it's called a Union Station. And upon opening in 1911, the station would see upwards of 10,000 passengers a day. And upon leaving the train, heading down the platform, although I've been in this station probably hundreds of times in my lifetime being born here, Bella was actually taken back by the grandeur of the station rotunda. And back in 1911 when the station opened, the motto was the bigger, the grander, and the more luxurious that you could present your station as, the passenger would probably think that the railway was rich, and if the railway was rich, that had to mean you were doing good in business, which meant that we were in good hands to travel with you, which, to be honest, makes complete sense why they did things the way that they did. And the year prior to it opening in August of 1910, the Grand Trunk Pacific announced plans to construct a railway hotel across the street from the station, and that was the Fort Garry Hotel. which coincidentally is actually our fixed address for tonight and the next Grand Railway Hotel stop in this series. And if there was ever a shot that beautifully summed up what it felt like to arrive 8 hours late in Winnipeg at 4 in the morning on a night so cold that Bella thought her legs were going to fall off.
If you stand out there for 5 minutes, you could die and lose your legs like I almost did.
No, you won't. It was this shot here. This is where this video is going to end, because next week's video is all about the Fort Garry Hotel, from its story as Winnipeg's second Grand Railway Hotel over a century ago, to narrowly escaping demolition in the 1980s, coupled with a less than lengthy stay, before we reboard and head east for Toronto, with absolutely no shortage of delays and no shortage of surprises ahead. This series is my love letter to Canada and the railways that built it. From downtown Montreal to downtown Vancouver, from the Northern Rockies in Jasper to the Southern Rockies in Banff, I'm traveling across Canada by train, rewinding the clock to share the stories of over a century ago before they're forgotten forever, along with some hidden gems nestled along the way. I'm curious, have you ever taken the Canadian before? Did you ride it through the southern route when it went through Calgary and Banff? Whatever it is, drop a comment down below because I would love to hear your story. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss next week's episode here in my birthplace of Winnipeg, documenting the Fort Garry Hotel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you then.